The beginning of this talk got cut off, and so did the last 10 minutes, so I'm filling in the intro and the last 10 minutes with the voiceover and the presentation slides. So this talk today is about my master's thesis. My master's thesis was titled The State-Reinforced Self-Governance of Community-Managed Open Spaces in Chicago, Illinois, and Louisville, Kentucky. It was a case study that focused on two community garden organizations, one in Chicago called NeighborSpace, and the other in Louisville, which was the Jefferson County Cooperative Extension Service. We compared these two organizations to see how they manage community gardens, and then also compared them in relation to state-reinforced self-governance.
State-reinforced self-governance, just kind of pared down into one sentence, is kind of this idea where governments support a grassroots organization that is doing some benefit to the local community, handling some sort of local issue, and the government is supporting them, but is not directly involved in their decision-making processes. So it's kind of widely understood that people need nature. Like, we love trees, we have plants in our offices. Green spaces in urban communities are incredibly important for a number of reasons. There's plants and grasses and bushes and shrubberies and things that can absorb toxins and pollutants from the soil. That's called phytoremediation. So those types of gardens can be really important to ecology and the ecosystems in urban areas. People who grow vegetables can save money on their grocery, or they can sell them and they can have economic viability in that way. And then green spaces in general are also really important for people's mental and physical health. If you have a park in your neighborhood, you're more likely to walk more. If you have a green space, you're more likely to walk and feel safer. So those are really important. And actually, there was a recent study that came out after I finished my thesis that I thought was really cool. So it looked at a couple communities in Philadelphia where there were vacant properties that were just overgrown and there was trash and people had dumped stuff there. And so they did, they had a control neighborhood where they didn't change the vacant lots, and then they had another neighborhood where they called it greening. So they took all the trash out, they mowed it, they put in a little low fence, they planted trees and flowers and maintained it regularly and made it look nice. And there was a significant change in people's self-reported levels of depression and poor mental health. So in the neighborhoods where these vacant lots were greened and made to look nicer, people reported up to 40 or 60% better mental health. So it's no question that green spaces and even like a little vacant lot that's no bigger than a house can have a real big impact on communities. So all across the world, people have kind of already known this. There are grassroots organizations and individuals who just kind of take on this role themselves, and they green these vacant lots and they make them look nice. But in many cities in the United States and even abroad, these lands are under threat because a lot of the time they don't own the property. Sometimes they'll do it just kind of like guerrilla gardening is the term for it. They'll just go in and do it without even talking to anybody. Sometimes they'll have a lease or a license with the landowner. It could be a private owner or the city department. And these are they're like currently under threat because anybody can come in with a better idea and destroy the garden and build a new apartment building or whatever on that land. So what's really cool is in Chicago, though, the city kind of recognized the importance of these spaces and how important it was to preserve them. And that's how we got to NeighborSpace, which is a nonprofit. It's a land trust, so it preserves these communities in the land trust so they can't, they're always going to be an open space. And it was formed by partnership between three city entities: the City of Chicago, the Chicago Parks District, and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County. And so it permanently preserves currently over 100 community gardens. And these are, when I say a community garden, and why I've used the term community managed open space, is because a garden just isn't a vegetable garden. It doesn't have to just grow vegetables, and it doesn't have to just be a couple individual plots, as I think a lot of Louisville gardens are. So that's kind of a preconception that a lot of people have. A garden can be, as I said, it can be a phytoremediation garden. It can be just a nice place that's well cared for. So that is the definition of a community garden that Neighbor Space implies, and they preserve over 100 of these, mostly in minority communities. So Neighbor Space is able to purchase land, usually from city departments, and it purchases them at a super low cost, or even free sometimes. It takes on ownership of the property and then gives the property over to the communities so that the communities can manage it however they feel is right for their own environment. This gives the communities a sense of autonomy, which is it's a sense of feeling like they have the power, that they're doing this on their own, and they are the ones making the majority of the decision makings. They decide what they want, where they want it, how they want it, who's going to be there. And what's also really interesting and what's really unique about Neighbor Space is that it encourages strong stakeholder involvements. So it's not just saying, you know, everybody here on this garden is going to come together and be a community, but they want to involve everybody in the community in this garden and really make it a larger community asset. So they really encourage that businesses, local businesses, neighbors, volunteers, churches, schools, and everybody play a part and be involved in the garden at some point. So besides Neighbor Space doing really good things, what's really interesting and why we decided to study it in terms of state reinforced self-governance is that it was not only created, but is currently supported by those 3 city departments. So in order to kind of understand, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So self-governance is this idea where kind of a grassroots organization or individuals come together and they manage and make decisions about an issue or a social ecological dilemma. And they manage that kind of on their own. They don't have any support or help from local government. A lot of the times, either the government doesn't even know about the organization and what they're doing, or doesn't care. It's just like, okay, you guys go do your own thing. So that's self-governance, is management of an issue without any sort of government involvement. And then there is cooperation and partnerships, which is the strong working together between in like a grassroots organization and the local government or state government. And then there's state reinforcement of self-governance, which I'll use that term occasionally too, which is the idea that there are these organizations that are self-governing, and then the state or local government will come in and give them reinforcements. So the state or the local government will come in and provide them with technical support, or they will give them the legal rights to do what they're doing, and give them the authorities and the responsibilities necessary to manage this issue that they're already managing. And a lot of the times this happens when the government realizes that this issue is kind of really far away from either the literal offices of government, so they can be in rural areas, or it can be an issue that is kind of mentally far away from a lot of people who are in government, so it can be in poor or minority communities where the government is like, I think, you know, these communities can better manage the resource on their own. In looking at state reinforced self-governance, I kind of determined that there are these 3 foundational principles, I call them, and they're derived from 9 principles by Dr. DeCaro and his colleagues that are called the legal and institutional design principles. They're factors that they found, they studied multiple cases of state reinforced self-governance around the world, and they found that these 9 factors were somewhat present in all of these cases. So the idea that kind of the chicken and the egg, which came first, but these 3 foundational principles I believe to be important for the state reinforcement of self-governance. You can't really have state reinforced self-governance without the state reinforcement, which are these 3 foundational principles. So that is that the first one, legal authority, so that's that the state or local government provides them, these grassroots organizations, with the legally binding authority to form and operate, to make decisions, to and to perform their duties to fulfill the mission and the responsibilities to make the best decisions and really manage this resource properly. And then that's all well and great, but if they don't give them the financial support, the material support, the technical support, and whatever support they might need, they're not going to be able to fulfill their responsibilities and their given authority. So these three are needed in cooperation and in succession for this to be successful. And in one case, this happens to be, in Chicago, the neighbor space happens to fall right into these foundational principles. In 1996, the City of Chicago, Chicago Parks District, Forest Preserve District of Cook County, those three organizations got together and created an intergovernmental agreement that gave Neighbor Space the authorities to form as a nonprofit and as a land trust. It gave them the authority to require land and keep it permanently, and then it gave the authority for Neighbor Space to give communities the direct decision-making responsibilities and manage open space. And then responsibility was also written into this intergovernmental agreement that Neighbor Space will acquire these lands. Neighbor Space will secure them as the owner, assume risks and liabilities, and then give the communities, I just said that, decision-making power. And then what's really cool and special too is that the city departments agreed to give, each department agreed to give $100,000 to Neighbor Space annually. So from local department, Neighbor Space gets $300,000 annually to support their mission. It also donates land to them or gives them the land at free or discounted purchase price, and also gives them lots of administrative support. So they work closely with local government, but local government is not directly involved in the decision making. So there are other ordinances and the Neighbor Space bylaws that give it further authority, responsibility, and support as well. So this really presents a strong case that state reinforced self-governance is present in Neighbor Space and with its partnership with the Chicago city government. So we decided to kind of look at how Louisville compares to this, just to kind of see what's going on here, how we can, and if we can, improve our community gardens, what kind of needs to be done, where we're at. It's a very different story from Neighbor Space. We chose the Jefferson County Cooperative Extension Service to study because of its direct relationship with local government and its direct designation by local government to manage community gardens on city property. So in that way, it was most relatable to Neighbor Space and most easily studied in terms of state reinforced self-governance. Extension services, if you don't know, they are partnerships with local or state land-grant universities. So this happened in 1914. There was a federal act that made extension services possible. It was a partnership between land-grant universities, and the extension service would take the information from these land-grant universities and provide them for the average citizen or give them to the farmers that can't attend the university and get that information. So the extension service disseminates that information, and there's one in every county in every state in this country. So the Jefferson County Extension Service in Louisville was designated to manage 10 community gardens on city property. These gardens are allotment gardens. They're plots, and individuals can come and they rent their little plot for a year or a season, and they come in and garden on it, and then they go home. And a lot of the times, the extension service will still hold decision-making power in where they can garden, who can garden, how many plots there are. So there's not really a whole lot of community involvement. There are some gardens are better than others. Some gardens, there are lots of people who come in and they encourage that community, the people who garden there. But then there are also times where, like I said, you come in and you garden, you pick your vegetables, and then you go home, and maybe you don't even interact with anybody. So there's also little to no stakeholder involvement or encouragement to be involved with the wider community. This really isn't the fault of the extension service itself. A lot of the times this is the lease agreements that the extension service is on with the city property that prevents them from giving the communities the decision-making power. So in their lease agreements, Jefferson Community Extension Service agrees to manage and be the main decision maker. And then there's also state statutes that prevent the Extension Service from owning land. So even if they had the funds, they couldn't even own the land. And furthermore, the agreement between Extension and local government to manage community gardens is only verbal. There's no documentation of this anywhere. And the only documentation really about what the Extension Service does or will do is a memorandum of agreement between Louisville Metro and the University of Kentucky, the partnered land-grant university, that gives that says how much money they'll be getting a year. And then of that, it's a verbal agreement of how much of that money is used for community gardens. So, as you may have guessed, there's not a whole lot of these factors present in the case of Jefferson County and Louisville, the Extension Service in Louisville. So these three documents are kind of the only ones that provide them with any sort of authority to manage the property and then to enter into lease agreements, responsibility to manage the property, and limited financial support. And but they are granted free access to the land, so the lease agreements, there's no monetary exchange. And then they also are provided free water as well, in most cases. That's another story. So what's the big difference here? Why did Chicago make these decisions to create neighbor space? Why hasn't Louisville? So other than the obvious, Chicago is a much larger city. They had a bigger vacant land problem. They have a larger budget. They have a larger population. Put those aside and think about how Chicago is currently. Chicago's city motto is actually Urbs in Horto, which means city in a garden. They've always been striving to achieve that motto. A lot of the times people will tell you that that doesn't make any sense for Chicagoans, but they're working towards it. They're really trying to make their city a lot greener. What's really interesting though is the state constitution in Illinois actually has a right for individuals to a healthful environment. So written into the state constitution is the needs for a healthy environment. State statutes and acts also encourage sustainability and environmental consciousness. There's a Green Governance Act, which encourages governors to make environmentally conscious planning decisions or any other legal decisions. And then there's City Space, which is a comprehensive open space planning document. This was the culmination of multiple open space and parks reports as a result of a U.S. Justice Department litigation. In 1982, the U.S. Justice Department actually sued the city of Chicago for racial discrimination. They claimed that Chicago failed to provide equal opportunity to recreational open spaces, recreational resources, and especially in high minority communities. So as a result of this, the Chicago departments, parks departments, and everything kind of got together and were like, okay, what can we do about this? How can we fix this problem? And that's how City Space came about. And it was funded and sponsored. It started planning in 1993, funded and sponsored by those three founding departments of Neighborspace. It consisted of 21 ambitious but realistic goals, and one of these goals included the creation of Neighborspace. This document recognized the importance of land ownership and recognized that lots of individuals and organizations around the city were already kind of gardening on these lands, but that they were subject to removal at any time, and recognized the importance of permanence. And that's why it recommended Neighborspace. And actually, during the planning process for City Space in 1996, before it was finally published, Neighborspace was created. Current sustainability efforts in Chicago also are really active in encouraging even more open space. Chicago's latest sustainability goals include creating parks and open spaces within a 10-minute walk of every citizen. So every citizen in Chicago within the next couple of decades should be able to have a 10-minute walk to any sort of park or open space in their community. So that's their goal. In Kentucky, however, our state constitution, statutes, and acts don't really recognize sustainability, environmental conservation, or environmental rights kind of at all. We were unable to find any documents that reference sustainability or conservation, and very limited environmental rights. So that's kind of sets the stage. And then in Louisville, the most comparable document to the city space document in Chicago was this Parks and Open Space Master Plan.
So the Open Space Master Plan was intended to inform the Cornerstone 2020, or the comprehensive plan in Louisville, and it really focused more on the larger natural parks and natural lands and agricultural areas in Louisville and Jefferson County, rather than small community parks and open spaces. I think it mentioned community gardens maybe once in a tiny little bullet off to the side somewhere. So the emphasis was really on larger areas and larger natural parks and things, rather than community gardens and the preservation of small community open spaces. This is kind of reflected in current sustainability efforts as well, where when parks are mentioned, there's a lot of reference to the large park system in Louisville and little focus on the small community parks and community gardens. There is, in some of the more recent documents, there is a recognition of how community gardens can improve vacant lots and how that's a potential solution, but there's still this underlying focus on the temporary status of a community garden, and that they're a temporary means to doing something with a vacant lot, and that they're not really a permanent solution, and that they're not really viewed as an asset to communities, kind of like Chicago does. Another interesting fact is that Louisville calls itself the city of parks. We actually have a lot more acres of parkland in Louisville than Chicago does. There are about approximately 243,000 acres of parkland in Louisville, but only 33% of our population live within walking distance of a park. That's a really big number, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, we have the Jefferson Memorial Forest and the parklands of Floyd's Fork, which are large parklands and natural areas, but are kind of far away from the majority of the population. However, in Chicago, it has a lot less acres of parkland, around 145,000 acres, but 92% of the Chicago population live within walking distance. So in Chicago, there's this really big emphasis on small community and neighborhood parks, which I think is really important to the sustainability of a city as well. And Chicago does too. In their Sustainability 2015 plan, it was a goal to increase all neighborhoods, so that all neighborhoods had a recreational area within a 10-minute walk. So every individual in Chicago could walk to a park in 10 minutes. And that was the goal for Chicago sustainability. So actually, across the country, lots of other cities have recognized the importance of permanence of community gardens, and they have designated kind of these grassroots or nonprofit or other sorts of organizations that are already working to preserve lands or working with community gardens, and the governments recognize the importance of preserving them and then designate these organizations as that role rather than creating their own, as Chicago did. And I think this is kind of the way that Louisville could go as well. Louisville has a better chance of adopting that method. So a couple organizations in Louisville that could potentially take up this role is Louisville Grows. This is a local organization that helps promote sustainability in Louisville. They plant lots of trees, they manage several community gardens around Louisville, and they also provide educational workshops, and they actually partner with the Jefferson County Extension Service often and quite closely. Right now, though, they're contracted by local government to plant trees. And so it's possible, as the local government found that, the tree canopy was really important and then ascribed Louisville Grows to this responsibility, Louisville Grows could potentially also take on community garden management if given that responsibility by local government as well. And then there is the Louisville and Jefferson County Environmental Trust. This currently actually manages mostly natural areas and agricultural lands in Louisville, kind of as the Parks and Open Space Master Plan stated. This trust actually came about after the Parks and Open Space Master Plan, so it's obvious that the focus of this trust is more on the natural and agricultural lands as the Open Space Plan was. But it's possible that this organization, this environmental trust, could have its mission and its mission tweaked a little bit, so that it could include community open spaces and smaller areas in the urban city. Other cities have done this, like I said. Lots of other cities, I think including Baltimore and Philadelphia and maybe Seattle, have adopted this method of entrusting their current organized environmental trust to take up community garden preservation. And then there's Brightside, which is actually an organization created as a nonprofit by Louisville local government in the 1980s. This organization was created to kind of clean and beautify Louisville, but it also previously managed multiple community gardens as a part of its Bright Sites initiative. It had many community gardens, which actually were switched over to management by the Jefferson Extension Service somewhere around the merger between Louisville and Jefferson County that happened in the early 2000s. I could not find exactly why this happened. There's no documentation of it, and there really wasn't a whole lot of information about why this occurred. So it's possible that with more information and trying to figure out exactly why Brightside let go of their community gardens, that maybe it's possible Brightside could take up management again. And then by being a nonprofit supported by local government already, this could be a really good potential avenue to be something like Neighbor Space here in Louisville. So regardless of what organization or how Louisville goes about doing this, it goes without saying that whatever organization takes up community garden preservation, they would need absolutely legally binding authority to fulfill their mission, responsibility to do the best, and support. They need the support from local government, and they need authority, and they need the responsibility in order to form and to fulfill community garden preservation in the best way that they possibly can. Another thing that they would need is to foster self-governance of the communities. So they would really need to encourage the communities to govern the land themselves the way that they see fit and what fits their community the best. And then to provide strong stakeholder involvements as well with the surrounding community and not just the people who work closely in the garden. So community gardens are important. Greening of urban areas are so important. Cities need nature. They can be gardens. Urban gardens can be phytoremediation gardens. Like I said, the plants and trees that take up toxins from the earth and can remediate the soil. And then there are rain gardens, which are plants and trees that prevent or abate runoff from roads and urban areas into streams and rivers. Growing vegetables in gardens for consumption or for sale can improve the economic viability of a community. And then also, like the victory gardens of the 1940s during the World War II, people grew food for the city just in case of a disaster, of a fallout, and that there was no more food, that the city was sustainable and could sustain itself and feed itself. And then again, the social aspects of a community garden and bringing the community together and improving the community and beautifying the community and making the neighborhood a more beautiful and a happier place. In Louisville, so many community gardens are doing such amazing work, and they are really improving their communities, but they're at risk because a lot of these community gardens are not stable. They don't own the land. They're constantly in risk of being redeveloped or bought out, and so their temporary status in the eyes of the government too, it's so short-sighted. There's no recognition that community gardens are so important to our communities. And we can do better. We can do better for the health and the well-being of Louisville, and we can do better especially for those most marginalized. Thank you.